Greetings and welcome to the Adeptus Artorum YouTube channel. I'm your host for this short video, Caros Retinue, and today I aim to continue what I'm now considering to make into a short series on the survivors of the Unification Wars. Don't worry if you missed our first video in this series on Herck, as it will be linked at the end of the video. I do want to specify for the record that the only available context on the Thunder Warriors within this video is in the Horus Heresy short story called Dreams of Unity. This is an excellent Black Library short written by Nick Kime, told from the perspective of one of the Thunder Warriors and a member of the Adeptus Custodes. The details in this tale are pivotal in understanding the gruelling fates of the more unlucky and less prominent Thunder Warriors in the aftermath of the events atop Mount Ararat. And with all this in mind, and without further ado, let's delve into today's video topic. Now, as we all know, the Unification Wars and subsequently the Thunder Warriors, yet regardless of importance to the story of humanity, are a somewhat brushed over topic by Games Workshop. The generalised view of the Thunder Warriors is backed up by very basic lore that wouldn't take you very long to sift through if looking for very basic facts and information on them. And for that reason, it seems as though their only purpose was essentially to hold a place in history where they put their blood, sweat and tears into the very foundation of the Imperium, yet unable to reap the rewards of their actions. Now, in our previous video in this series, we covered the legendary Thunder Warrior known as Herck, Taranis, and his battle brother and long-serving lieutenant, Goethe. In continuation, I honestly wish I could come back to the topic of the surviving Thunder Warriors with even more tales of hope and future prosperity, but unfortunately, this just isn't the case. To begin this grim delve into the other surviving Categis warriors, we will begin our tale starting with the Thunder Warrior known by his brothers as Dahren Heruk. Heruk was a veteran of many battles of the Unification Wars and faced off against some of the most fearless techno-barbarian tribes that Terra had to offer in the days before Unity. This included the likes of the Kievian Rus, techno-barbarian natives to the region that we know as Old Earth Russia, the Hoth Grendel clans that he helped to remove from prominence in Albia or Old Earth Albania, and involvement in the Siege of Abyssina, a famed conflict within the scripture of the Unification Wars. These were all legendary conflicts that were pivotal in the formation of the future Imperium and the re-establishment and reunification of Terra. Together with his fellow Categis battle brothers Vula, Cabe and Gyro, Herck would survive these conflicts, learning many important techniques of combat and survival that could only have been honed to such a standard through these experiences. Now, unlike Herck Taranis, each of these battle brothers held no position of command or status and serve as lesser examples of Thunder Warriors within the ranks of their legions. In the aftermath of the atrocities committed atop Mount Ararat, in which, at the very moment of victory for the Thunder Warriors, the Adeptus Custodes were ordered by the Emperor to slaughter their ranks without mercy or consequence, these four battle brothers would escape this vile treachery, and their fates would lead them on a slightly different path to the likes of Herck and Goethe. Now, though the information on how this came to occur isn't readily attainable in written source material, regardless of how they came to be there, the four battle brothers would go on to join the ranks of a gladiatorial ludus in the Maw, ran by an ex-astropath named Tarigata. Tarigata was also on the run from Imperial authorities and trying to make a living to the best of his abilities, and so given their natural fighting instincts and prowess, it's assumed that there was no question in the old astropath's mind that these giant brutes were going to earn him a pretty penny in the gladiatorial arena. Tarigata lived within a time-worn shantytown known as the Swathe, which stretched for miles across the outskirts of the Outer Palace districts, and each Thunder Warrior would seemingly develop a unique but respectable relationship with him as their Dominus, symbiotically earning a living and remaining free of judgment from the greater Imperium. This would seemingly work well for them for a while, until in the beginning days of the Horus Heresy, when things would begin to take a turn. The first of these dark turning points occurred deep in the depths of the Maw. In the filth-ridden gladiatorial pits, Herck and Tarragata stood amongst the somewhat dwindling crowd, watching Cabe, one of the aforementioned Thunder Warriors, fight for the honour of their ludus against an enraged Chrono Gladiator. For those of you who don't know what a Chrono Gladiator is, it's essentially a human being that's been implanted with a preset self-description clock, which gains initial time that adds to their lifespan within a circumstance in which they enter combat. Of course, for the most part, these men or women would be picked from the ranks of humanity, traditionally for criminal punishment, though it could vary as to the circumstances of how they ended up there. But almost every time, as you can imagine, it's not of their own free will. So, within the depths of the maw, Cabe fought this hulking monstrosity. By this stage, it was more machine than man. Its eyes were red and bloodshot, and it desperately fought with what could only be described as a frenzy. With so much to lose and only one thought within its mind, the Chrono Gladiator, spear in hand, began to get the better of Cabe. Cabe's left leg slipped, and the incoming spear impaled him. The Chrono Barbarian roared with delight and kicked the skewered Thunder Warrior into the dirt, chanting at the crowd and goading Cabe, leaving him there to lay, suffering within a pool of his own blood. Although mid-conversation with Tarragata, upon seeing this dishonour unfold from the arena stands, Herck jumped down into the pit, and the crowd became ecstatic. When they began to chant his name, Herck began to have flashbacks to the glory he once felt atop Mount Ararat, when he witnessed Arictaranis raise the sacred lightning banner. Within that moment, he relived a small part of the glory he felt as he flew at the Chrono Barbarian. With an unrelenting force, and though the fight was hard, Herck overcame his foe, watching its life clock slowly diminish. Swooping up Cabe's sword from the ground, and the Chrono Gladiator now on its knees, Herck took the final swing to remove its head. Now free of combat and proclaiming, "You should have just killed him," Herck wandered over to his battle brother, kneeling beside him and returning his sword to his hand. In an attempt to console his dying battle brother, Herck would say, "There's blood on your lungs, Cabe. Don't try to speak. Be still, it's almost over now." He placed the tip of his sword atop of Cabe's chest, placed his other hand upon his legionary tattoo inked onto his left shoulder, leaned in to his brother and whispered, "To the honoured death." Cabe gave an unmistakable nod, and the look of fear in his expression had suddenly changed to a look of peace. With this, Herck thrust his sword into Cabe's chest, giving him the honoured warrior's death that he deserved. After the battle, Herck would exit the gates of the arena to be greeted by both his Dominus Tarragata and his fellow Thunder Warrior and Gladiator Vula Vul. Now, Vula is a very good example of a Thunder Warrior who is quite severely afflicted by the many various flaws in their design. Vula would often lose awareness of where he was at the mere mention of battle, his mind taking him back to multiple events of the Unification Wars, and his body in the beginning phases of a rampage. In my opinion, Vula relied on his other battle brothers like Herck to keep him grounded with a clear sense of reality. In the occasion of Herck returning to Tarragata and himself, Vula begins to drift off into his own mind. When Tarragata proclaims that, regardless of being hunted by the Imperium like rats, Vula would still consider himself in service to the Emperor, Vula replies, "The Legion ever serves," and begins to reach for his axe. Herck would place his hand atop Vula's to prevent him from drawing his weapon, and eventually, after replying in vague warlike responses from his grueling past, Vula, with the help of Herck, would become grounded again, though clearly very disorientated. Vula made it very apparent that should he slip into complete madness, he wished for Herck to grant him the honoured death. Now, Vula and Herck both are very nostalgic of what they called the Time of Unity, obviously referring to their many campaigns in the Unification Wars, and as a lot of brothers do, they would go each to lengths to console the other by attempting to convince themselves that it wasn't anything to miss, before both finally coming back to the crushing realisation that they in fact missed it with their very souls. Both Herck and Vula had come to the conclusion long ago that they had become shadowed husks of their former selves, riddled with the many defects that came hand in hand with their place as Thunder Warriors, and also their age. It had become very apparent to both of them that they had lived for far too long. By this stage, Herck would often proclaim that some Thunder Warriors were far too stubborn to die. Now, returning back to the swathe, Herck, Cabe's corpse upon his shoulder, and Vula recovering from his outburst, would make their way back to Tarigata's Hab, a property in which they all lived. Inside the property was a lab of sorts, if you could really call it that, in which the Thunder Warriors within his Ludus could use the remains of their fallen battle brothers to essentially repair themselves, and Tarigata possessed the means in which to enact said repairs. After the deed was done, they would burn whatever remained of the corpse in a giant furnace behind the property. Now, this is obviously a grim process, and interestingly enough, Herck felt very ashamed of what he and his brothers had seemingly become, claiming that those of them that had survived had become ghouls, their continued existence depending on the deaths and successful appropriation of the parts of their former brothers in arms. Sadly, this statement says to me that these specific Thunder Warriors were unfortunately filled with a lot of self-loathing, and I feel as though this self-loathing removed their willingness to strive for better, allowing them to easier accept grim and drab existences. Now, the fourth Thunder Warrior confirmed to belong to Tarigata's Ludus was Gyro. Gyro and Herck had fought together in every battle. They had developed a relationship as very close friends, but by the time we hear of him, he's lost control of his sanity too, very similarly to Vula, but to a much greater extreme. After the events of Cabe's arena match and subsequent death, Tarigata would send Herck to look for Gyro, as it had been brought to his attention that he was missing. Unfortunately for Herck, he would find Gyro within a corpse-soaked exterior of a swathe dive bar. His eyes were bloodshot and his stare was blank. Herck asked him if he was responsible for the corpses laid strung across the venue, and it had become apparent to Herck by this stage that Gyro had already slipped into madness, and attempting to bring him back into the present. Gyro was unable to be calmed until it came to the stage where Herck had remembered what Vula had said that he would want should his madness take over him. With this and a swift act of mercy, Herck pushed his sword into his brother's chest. As his brother began to fall, Herck put out his arms, caught Gyro and lowered him to the floor carefully, before Gyro let out his final words. "We were not meant to last." For Herck, this was a very painful situation, and he could barely keep his head held up. For though it was true that Cabe had served with him as a battle brother, Gyro had become his very close friend. Upon returning to Tarigata's Hab with Gyro's body, Herck would be horrified with the events that would meet him there. The smell of smoke filled his nostrils as he stood in a deep gaze staring at the property that was now engulfed by flames. Quickly, Herck held his breath and stormed into the burning building. There he was met by the frail old astropath Tarigata laid strung across the floor. He was close to death and with a rad pistol in hand. Herck had come to the unfortunate conclusion that in his absence, Vula had succumbed to his infliction, and just like Gyro, had descended into complete madness. And it seemed as though Tarigata, in an attempt to stop him, when in turn, he had been viciously attacked by Vula. As Herck carried Tarigata's corpse out of the burning Hab, he passed him his rad pistol. Herck slotted it into his empty holster and laid him on the floor. Tearing a piece of his cloth from his underarmour and tying it around the empty eye sockets of the old astropath. In this moment, Herck knew that this had to end. Out of options and feeling greatly saddened by the loss of his brothers, Herck proclaimed there and then over the corpse of Tarigata that this was his burden now. He would find Vula and put an end to this madness by giving him the honoured death that he had requested. Vazula's trail wasn't difficult to follow, and after a short while following it, Herck discovered the symbol of the Thunder Legion carved into a stone stairwell. Following the mark, Herck would find himself within the flood. The Flood was an ancient run-down region of the Swathe that had been forgotten by time. But at one stage, it was very clearly beautiful. By this time period though, it was a dark, depressing place, the only light coming from a very dim phosphor lamp shoddily lined across the catacomb walls. Wondering to himself why Vula would kill Tarigata, and at the same time questioning it highly, Herck muttered out loud into the darkness, "Is this our last battle, brother?" Much to Herrick's shock, an unexpected voice of Vula replied to his question from the darkness, and Herck locked eyes upon his location. "I have fought my last battle already," muttered Vula. His body laid propped against the catacomb walls. He asked Herck if he was armed, to which Herrick prompted towards the sword he had already drawn when he'd first approached the darkness. Vula was mortally wounded and also blinded. Upon noticing this, Herrick would ask, "Who has done this to you?" And Vula would go off on a slight monologue about how the Emperor had given his attacker everything and left the Thunder Legions to rot. He said that something had been hiding amongst them in the Swathe, and that they had led him here and left him to die. As Vula let out his last dying breath and whispered his final words to Herrick, he proclaimed, "They said he was coming." And with that, the life left his body. Herrick was still very uncertain in his own mind as to who it was his brother was speaking of, but in the distance he saw a dimly lit tunnel clearly leading up to a larger open space, and within it he could hear the clash of weapons. Standing up and giving a nod to his fallen brother, Herrick began to make his way to the sounds of battle, and upon reaching his destination, he was shocked at what he would find. Laid on the ground beneath the heel of what Herrick could only deem to be a hideously mutated Astartes legionnaire with great big claws, where his hands once were, and surrounded by Chaos cultists, laid the gold-clad custodian guard, known as Tygo Malchian. The cultists were repeating a singular chant over and over again. "He is coming! Lupercal! Lupercal! Lupercal!" Now, though Herrick didn't know this custodian personally, and strangely enough, regardless of the fact that his kind were essentially destroyed by them, he remembered the Wars of Unity and the fact that the Thunder Legions had served alongside the Adeptus Custodes, dying together in the service of the Emperor. Maybe in this moment, Herrick, after seeing the fates of his brothers descending into madness, was beginning to understand the actions of the Emperor in ordering the Custodes to cull them all. The events atop Mount Ararat definitely now seemed like a mercy as opposed to the grim fates of Cabe, Gyrock and Vula. Rushing to the custodian's aid, Herrick found himself confronted by the ranks of Chaos cultists, whom had drawn jagged makeshift blades from beneath their rugged robes. Entering into a bloody combat with the cultists, Herrick impaled his first adversary on the end of his sword, and following this sudden action, he felt a blade stab deep into his bicep. Thinking of what he had learned in the gladiatorial arena, Herrick only gave out a small, barely unnoticeable shriek of pain. He did not want to make his enemy aware of this moment of weakness, but within short continuation, another blade would pierce into his back. This time, he let out a roar. By this stage, Herrick was also drifting in and out of his dreams of unity, and did everything in his power to stay in the present, realising that if he drifted off, both he and the custodian would be killed for sure. Herrick would eventually kill every cultist, each meeting a more violent end than the next. He impaled two, headbutted one's skull in half, and kicked out another's spine, before the leader eventually brandished her rugged, carved blade and slit her own throat. Even in this moment, Herrick found it humorous that she would prefer to die by her own hand than face it. And now she was dead, there was only one enemy left to face. Upon staring at the corrupted form of the heretic Astartes, which after reading this story in depth multiple times, I think it's fair to assume is either a raptor or a warp talon from the Alpha Legion, Herrick now had only one thought in his mind. Tarigata had often spoke to him of the darkness descending upon Terra, but until this stage, Herck and his brothers had always found it hard to believe. In this moment, how could he possibly deny it? The fact that Tarragata was an astropath had clearly given him insight far beyond that of a Thunder Warrior, and in this sudden moment of realisation, Herck knew that he stood in the presence of one that had betrayed the values of the Emperor, and he'd most certainly succumb to what he described as evil. In this moment, Herck proclaimed, "Evil is amongst us, defying the Emperor's rule of order, and I serve the Emperor, always have, always will. It's my oath, it's the thunder and the lightning." Suddenly, the heretic turned, its gaze upon Herck. "For unity!" he roared, as the two behemoths charged at each other, man against beast. In the moment that Herrick's blade clashed with the beast's grotesque talons, Herck began to feel more than just physical pain. This creature's presence, it was hard for him to describe, but it was just wrong, a deeper malice. He could hear voices of the long dead and see visions of a place after death in which he was being sacrificed to some entity from the beyond. The beast slashed at Herck, and in return he slashed back at the beast, severing one of its talon-like hands. Much to his horror, however, the appendage would flop to the ground, jump up onto its fingers as though a spider, and scuttle off into the shadows. Herck continued to face off against the heretic, barely able to hold it off. In fact, the creature laughed at his efforts. It was enough to make the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Out of instinct, maybe even design, Herck reached his arm down to his holster, clasping his hand on the rad pistol that Tarragata had given him. In a split second, he rose it to the Astartes, unsure of if it would even fire, and he squeezed the trigger. The blast of unburial radiation lasted just long enough for Herck to swing his sword at it with all his might. And as the creature let out a barely wounded sound, Herck fell to his knees, knowing that he had given all he had, beginning to feel the depths of his failure. "For unity," he moaned, as he spat blood in the direst of moments. Herck would hear his words repeated as the custodian suddenly sprang back into action, approaching from behind the heretic, shouting, "For unity!" before splitting its head in two with his giant golden blade, a second blow piercing the creature's heart and rendering it lifeless and inanimate, strung across the floor. Knelt on the floor, supported by the pommel of his sword, Herck asked the custodian if it was dead, to which the custodian explained it was, in a manner of speaking, and that Herck had his thanks. And so Herck formally introduced himself by name. Of course, he felt as though he could see the custodian weighed against his own judgment as to what to do with him. The custodian followed to ask him if he was of the Thunder Legion, to which Herck nodded. "I thought your kind were all dead," asked the custodian, to which Herck replied, "We are, near enough," tipping his head to the custodian, assured Herck that he owed him a debt, and so did Terra. Preventing the custodian from sheathing his sword, Herck told him that he could repay his debt right now, and that he had only one thing left to ask. Without it even being said, the custodian simply nodded. Herck closed his eyes as his dreams of unity grew ever stronger. He heard the cheers of victory as the lightning banner was lifted into the sky. He stood amongst the slopes of Mount Ararat with Gyro, Cabe and Vula at his side as reality grew fleeting. Herck whispered, "Give me the honoured death." And so with a swift and merciful swipe, the custodian delivered the final blow that would put the last of the four Thunder Warriors at peace. As a final statement, I will say this. Herck, Cabe, Vula and Gyro are very interesting characters indeed, especially when considering the fates of Thunder Warriors that escaped their execution atop Mount Ararat within the final battle of the Unification Wars. Their story serves as an extra layer for the Thunder Warriors as a whole, introducing us the mindset and the lifestyle of less fortunate members of their ranks, afflicted by their many defects. As a whole, I can safely say Thunder Warriors interest me deeply, and as a topic of discussion, give us so much to think about concerning their past, possible present, and hopefully their future. Alright guys, now unfortunately it comes to that time in the video where I must leave you. However, as is tradition on the channel, I'm going to leave you guys with a relevant quote for today's video topic. We are the lightning. We were his first, but now amongst the last. We lived too long, and now we wish to die. The only death that matters, the honoured death. Okay guys, this has been a relatively short video on Dahren Heruk and the Thunder Warrior Gladiators. Thank you to each and every one of you who watch our videos. Your support to the channel honestly means a lot to us. If you liked this video, go ahead and hit that like button. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date with all future video content. With that, I've been your host for this video, Caros Retinue, and once again and as always, I thank you all for watching.